Hello, hello, and welcome to the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. This is Dr. Gordon Walker. This is a pretty exciting opportunity to kind of talk in an open forum about some of the things I'm really excited about with regards to fungi. I'm going to talk a little bit about, my journey, how I learned about fungi, where I've gotten to by being sort of obsessed with mushrooms over the past 5 years. And a lot of this is going to come from the perspective of a scientist. I'm a PhD biochemist with a background in wine science, actually, and I spent a long time studying fermentation and yeast. And that was sort of the academic basis for how I learned about fungi, was through the eyes of a scientist and also through the eyes of a forager, because I've come at this, not just from a pure scientific perspective, but very much from the perspective of being someone who likes to eat mushrooms. And I love that. And I hope to share some of that passion and excitement with you guys. So thanks for tuning in. I think the format of this is usually going to be sort of me talking for a good 15, 20 minutes. And then if you guys have questions, I'll open it up. Happy to discuss things. I'm also going to be streaming on Twitch, at least for this first episode. And we'll see if I keep doing it. So if you want to see some visual accompaniment to what I'm doing here, you can check that out. But the podcast itself will be living here on the Call-In app. And so I hope you guys are down to check it out. I think there's some other really great creators on this platform. And like I said, I'm just excited to be here. So let's hop into it. What are my mushroom origins and why am I so fascinated by fungi? And I think, as with most things, when people look at themselves, you can trace the origins of my fascination back to childhood, because, what happens in our childhood that doesn't somehow leave an inextricable like mark on us and forever change the way that we interact with the world, because we were, for better or for worse, molded as children. So I definitely had a few experiences as a kid that had really big impacts on me and how I viewed the natural world. Several of those were very fungal centric. And I think at least the earliest memory I have is probably from being about 3 or 4 years old. And we used to go up to Lake Tremblant in Quebec. It was a little lake in northern Quebec. And my grandparents had a cabin up there. So my mom had spent a lot of her childhood at this little cabin. And it was very, no electricity, gas lamps, kerosene. There were, it was sort of a nice log cabin, and there's a little living room. I remember looking in there and seeing, National Geographics from like the 1920s and stuff like that. So it was pretty old school little cabin, but it was right on a lake, and it was absolutely gorgeous. And as part of being up there, we would walk from my grandparents' cabin over to my uncle's cabin. And just through this little bit of forest, we would see such an amazing diversity of mushrooms. And so I remember being with my mom, kind of walking along, just like, what is that? What is that? What is that? And she had at least some basis in understanding fungi, because her father had been sort of into mushroom hunting. And so she had a little bit of context, but didn't know enough to kind of tell me everything. So we ended up taking a few of my favorites and bring them back to the cabin and having my grandfather look at them. And one mushroom in particular, I really remember, because it was green and it was slimy, and it really didn't look like any of the other mushrooms that I had seen. And I was dead convinced that this was an alien mushroom, 100%. I was like, this thing's from outer space. There's no way you can tell me otherwise. And my grandfather took one look at it and said, that's a parrot mushroom. And at the time I was like, I rebuked him. I was like, no way. This is an alien thing. Granted, I was like 4 years old, but I know now that he was absolutely correct. That is a parrot mushroom. It's a Gliophorus. It's a kind of waxy cap, and they're beautiful little green mushrooms that have a really viscid, wet sort of polysaccharide layer on top of them. So they're really gooey if you try to touch them, but they have absolutely beautiful, sort of unreal green caps and yellow stipes, and they almost glow on the forest floor, especially if the light hits them. So that was one of my earliest fungal finds that really kind of captured my imagination. And I think, somewhere deep inside of me seated this lifelong fascination. So that was just one of many experiences that I'm going to keep telling you guys about. And this is partially why when I do live streams, I people always ask me like, hey, why do you love fungi? What inspired you? And I'm like, this is a long answer. This needs time to think about it, to talk about it. Can I share the breadth of my experience? And that's what I'm hoping to do with you guys here. So found the parrot mushroom as a kid, was utterly enthralled. I had another really important memory that probably happened around age 5 or so, where my mom and I were going on a little hike, and we were up on sort of a grassy area in Rockport, Massachusetts. And I saw this giant white lump. And I was like, what is this thing? What is this crazy white thing growing out of a lawn? And my mom knew enough to say, hey, Gord, that is a puffball. And we can eat that as long as it's all white inside. So I got very excited because the idea of like finding free food out in nature was very compelling. So we took it home, and my mom, I think, did a little bit of research, kind of checked it out. And this is like in the days pre-internet. So she had to pull out an honest to goodness book. I'm pretty sure she probably pulled out Dave Aurora's Mushrooms Demystified, took a good look at that. I believe we also had the All the Rain Promises and More, two of those very sort of classic mushroom books. Problem with those books is they don't necessarily do a great job of giving you the confidence that you might want when you go to look at an edible mushroom, because there's a lot of sort of nuance and variation, and there's not really a lot of pictures in those books, at least not as many pictures as you might want. But puffballs are pretty safe, and so we felt good going ahead and slicing up some steaks and just frying them off in butter. And I remember the first moment of that sort of soft, pillowy, savory marshmallow hitting my mouth and going, whoa, what is this? This is not like anything else I've ever eaten. It's not like anything else I've experienced. I certainly have never seen free food coming up out of this lawn. So it was a moment that really stuck with me. And I have, in some ways, forever been chasing the dragon of that first perfect puffball, because I have never really found a giant puffball, certainly not like the ones that I've seen on TikTok where people have these enormous, beach volleyball or like whatever sized mushrooms. I've found plenty of small ones, but really nothing bigger than my fist. And so someday I dream again of finding a gigantic puffball, and maybe getting to do the cool thing where you like make pizza crust or something like that. But I digress. The sort of perfect puffball bite was enough to inspire me for a lifetime of foraging and eating and getting really, really deep into fungi. So I had a few other experiences as a kid, again, that really kind of laid down this foundational interest and helped weave a lot of these threads of a fascination for me. So my dad is a scientist, and that's certainly where I got a lot of my interest in science from, because he shared his passion with me as a child. And it sort of just, cultivated an interest in learning about the natural world, about food, about, gardening, and all of these things. There were so many delicious things in life that I couldn't turn away. And so my parents gave me a lot of good exposure to things that I just thought were kind of lame at the time, because I think as a child, you think that everything your parents are into is somehow not cool. But looking back at it, I'm like, wow, I got a lot of really cool exposure and stuff that seeded me to be a more interesting adult. So I would certainly recommend anyone with kids is don't pull any punches. Show your kids everything. Get your kids interested in the stuff that you're interested in, because you never know what may stick. My parents tried a lot of things on me. Not many things stuck, but a few things certainly came back with a vengeance and a passion, and have driven me to learn more in my life. So another one of the ones that I found really interesting and really compelling was we had a stump in the yard from a tree that had died, and most likely the tree was probably killed by fungus, but we didn't necessarily know that at the time. It was just, I think it was a big choke cherry tree that had kind of dominated part of the yard. And my dad had taken out because he wanted to make room for a mini orchard that he was planting. So they needed sun. They wanted the root system gone. And he looked at having some stump grinding done. But stump grinding turned out to be like, I don't know, $2,000 or something, get a stump ground out of the yard. My dad's like, why would I spend all of that money to just get rid of a stump? So he looked into a biological solution, and he found out that you could buy chicken of the woods plugs. So chicken of the woods is Latipris cincinnatus. Latipris sulphuris is the classic chicken of the woods. There's a few different Latipris species. Anyhow, chicken of the woods is a big orangey yellow polypore. It's absolutely delicious. Tastes like chicken. Has awesome texture. It can make about 1 in 20 people kind of sick. So you should always be kind of careful when you're trying it. But other than that, is a very robust, very good edible mushroom. And so my dad discovered that you could buy these little sort of wood plugs that had been pre-inoculated with the mycelium of this mushroom. So he went out, ordered these plugs, brought them to the house, and we drilled a bunch of little holes in the stump and pounded them in with a hammer and then sealed it over with wax. And so I was very excited about this when we did it. And I have sort of a memory of just getting, super stoked because he showed me what the mushroom looked like. And I was like, this is going to be awesome. But as a child, I had a very short, attention span, as kids often do. So, I kind of went and checked it a few days in a row. And then I was like, nothing's happening. I'm giving up. And that's fine because mycelium takes time. And, chicken of the woods is a what's called a brown rot fungi. So it had to fully kind of colonize the stump and start digesting all the cellulose that's there in the stump before any real action could happen. But lo and behold, the next year, after we had plugged the stump, we started getting mushrooms. These beautiful orangey yellow polypore started growing out of the side of the stump. And it's almost indescribable to really tell you guys about it, but like the kind of orange and yellow this mushroom displays is like, it glows, it's vibrant, it will just catch your eye out of nowhere. So I went out and for several days kind of watched this thing growing, and I was like, Dad, when can we eat this? When are we going to be able to eat this? And I think he wanted to let it get a little bit bigger, but I was like, we got to try this now. And I was worried about someone taking it and all this other stuff. So we ended up slicing off a big chunk of shelf and bringing it in. And again, just doing a very simple saute in butter. And it was absolutely amazing. It had such incredible, kind of like, frankly, chickeny flavor. Like chicken doesn't have a whole lot of its own flavor necessarily. And chicken of the woods is somewhat similar in that it doesn't have a very strong flavor of its own, but it very much takes on the flavor of whatever you cook it with. So again, if you cook it in some butter and salt, it really does help the natural flavor there shine through. And there's a little bit of sort of a acidic, woody tinge to it because it's a polypore that grows on wood, but there's a very definite meat character as well. And a lot of that comes from the texture of chicken of the woods. And certainly as I've grown and eaten a lot more of it, I'm recognizing the way that you cut it and butcher it influences heavily the way that it's perceived in the mouth. But at the time, I was just on cloud nine, like eating this beautiful orangey polypore. And for like a week or two, we were able to kind of munch on it. And I was really excited because I was like, we're going to get more of this. And we did get a few more fruitings. But frankly, I think the stump that we'd plugged was already fairly degraded. And so for about 2 years there, we got like nice flushes of chicken in the woods off this one stump. And then eventually the stump kind of just decayed and turned into part of the yard. Which was, way less invasive than it would have been to have a stump grinder come in. And I got to have the experience of trying chicken in the woods and even seeing mushroom cultivation firsthand. So that had a big influence on how I kind of viewed the world and was excited about, mushroom cultivation and understanding how incredibly tasty mushrooms could be. So I also was very privileged and lucky as a kid to get some time living in Paris. So as part of my dad being a professor, he took a sabbatical when I was about age 7 to 8. And we moved to Paris for about 9 months, where he was working at the Louis Pasteur Institute. And while we were living in Paris, pretty much every weekend, we would get to go travel to different parts of France. And I got tremendous exposure to all sorts of amazing French food. My parents always let me try just a little bit of wine, so I got some exposure to French wine. But one of the things that I fell deeply in love with was some of the mushrooms that we ate. And so I remember very specifically being in Geneva, Switzerland, Geneva. And I think it was the night that maybe Italy beat Brazil or Brazil beat Italy. I don't know. This is like 1994. You can look it up, see who won the World Cup that year. But one of the teams was celebrating very, very loudly. And so we were in this like super fancy restaurant. And I was served a little plate of morels and cream sauce. And it was a transcendent experience trying morels for the first time, especially bathed in this amazing cream sauce. But I have this real memory of it because it was sort of this like incredible moment of like me reaching my culinary peak and being so amazed by what was in my mouth, contrasted by this sort of like loud honking and celebration and other stuff going on outside. It was sort of one of those surreal moments. that I will forever remember. But that was when I fell in love with morels in Switzerland, bathed in cream sauce. I also got exposed to black truffle. And I don't remember exactly the first time I had it, but I know that there was a very fancy French restaurant in Paris that I would frequently lobby that we should go to. And I think we went there maybe 2 or 3 times while living in Paris. But I was absolutely in love with this place. It was called Laetitia, old school name for Paris. And they had some sort of dish that was like, I think it was little tubes of pasta stuffed with foie gras and like a little piece of truffle. And like trying that was just, they'd come like shaved fresh truffle on it. And foie gras and truffle, that is something very special. But black truffles in general are just really incredible mushrooms. They're Ascomycetes that grow mycorrhizally with hazelnut and oak. And they really only come up for sort of part of the tree's lifespan. So in some ways, they work best in plantations and cultivated forests that have been planted with the intention of potentially having truffles associated with them. I'll do a whole podcast episode on truffles another time because they're deeply fascinating and super interesting. They definitely deserve their own treatment, but they were another one of the things that inspired me to sort of be in love with fungi. Because again, it was something that came in through this olfactory pathway where I was eating it and just became so interested and so kind of obsessed with how good they could be. And I know that, all of this stuff concurrently was happening with my parents. So they were sort of learning and tasting some of these mushrooms for the first time too, coming home and saying, man, how do we eat stuff like this? How do we get access to things like that? So it was a pretty special experience living there in Paris for a little while. I also had an experience, and this was sort of the other side of my fungal fascination, was fungi are just mushrooms, right? So all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. And my dad and I took a weekend trip to Belgium. I'd always wanted to go to Belgium. I read the Asterix and Obelix books as a kid and was very inspired to want to visit there. So my mom was I don't know, she went somewhere and visited a chateau or a castle or something like that. My dad, we're going to go to Belgium. We're going to go to Brussels. And as we're on the train there, he is describing this drink to me that he's very excited about. It's called a kriek. It's a double fermented cherry sour beer. And so what they do to make kriek is they do initial fermentation to make a lambic. So it's kind of a brown ale without a whole lot of hops. And they'll do a wild fermentation, wild mixed fermentation. So you get yeast and bacteria in there, making a beer that's fairly sour. And it's sort of a base beer that is sour and barrel aged. And then what they'll do is they'll take that sour barrel aged primary beer and do a secondary fermentation with fruit. So kriek is the one that they do a secondary fermentation with these tart cherries. And you end up with this beautifully sort of pink beer that has a nice tart edge with a little bit of that fruity sweetness. So he's telling me all about this beer, and I'm like, yeah, whatever, Dad. I'm like 7. I don't care about beer, but he's a microbiologist, so he's very, very excited about it. And we get to Brussels, we roam around, eat some chocolate, and he's like, hey, let's go sit down at a plaza. And so we go to this big sort of plaza lined by buildings all around. There's guys in the middle of it playing soccer. We sit down. It's about like mid-afternoon. We have sort of nice full sunshine on us. And my dad orders a kriek. I get, I think, some kind of soda or something like that. And out come the drinks. And there is this long glass, sort of tulip shaped, with this vibrantly pink foamy liquid in it, with little droplets coming down the side of the glass. And I'm like, Dad, what is that? And he's like, Gord, that's the kriek I've been talking about. I was like, oh my God, can I try some? And he's like, well, your mom's not here, so sure, go for it. And I took a sip of that beer, and man, the heavens parted, the sun shone down, the angels sang. I was in love. It was sweet. It was tart. It was crisp. It was like bubbly. It was all of these amazing fruit flavors and sort of a confluence of just like different sensory aspects. And, I kept asking for a little sip more, a little sip more. He was nice enough to let me try some. He didn't let me get drunk, but I really fell in love with kriek that day. And I fell in love because he started telling me about the science of how it happened, of these sort of concurrent microbial fermentations that happen in sequence to make this beer. And when we got back from having lived in Paris, we actually went ahead and started trying to brew our own Kriek. So I got some experience doing a little bit of brewing, seeing the yeast firsthand. I also got some experience with spoilage because we brewed the base beer and then we pitched the cherries. And then my dad got pretty busy with grant season and other things kind of took his attention away. So we were checking the beer and eventually it molded over because we weren't doing a very good job of maintaining headspace. And I know now the problems that went wrong and how we could have made it differently. But it was an awesome experience to kind of do some microbiology in real time, very applied with my dad, and also get to experience some of the, let's call it not failure, but learning experiences that come along with brewing and the necessity for cleanliness and microbial control. But all of that contributed very heavily to my interest in not just mushrooms, but fungi, because yeast are a fungi and they are primarily responsible for alcoholic fermentation. And that became very important later in my life because I think around age maybe 10 or 11 was like the last time that I kind of remember interacting with fungi, at least as a kid. We had an apple tree in the yard that was dying and couldn't figure out why it was dying. But then in the fall, we got a big cluster of mushrooms around the base, which I know now were honey mushrooms or armillaria. And armillaria are extremely strong pathogenic parasitic fungi. They use what are called rhizomorphs. So it's sort of weaponized mycelium. Mycelium uses sort of white fluffy stuff you see in the soil. Rhizomorphs are like its evil looking cousin. They're these like little black tendrils that creep through the soil and they'll invade up between the bark and the wood of a tree. And they will cut off the flow of the xylem and the phloem and essentially girdle the tree. So they kill the tree and then they eat the tree, feasting on its dead bodies, and then send out more rhizomorphs to kill more trees. So these honey mushrooms are pretty good at killing trees that have any kind of compromised immune system, and our apple tree was toast. So we didn't know what they were, and we remember taking this big sort of shopping bag full of them into the Harvard Mycological Society and basically saying, can we eat this? And mycologists in general are very hesitant to say, yeah, go ahead and eat that, because every mushroom can potentially cause people an issue. Honey mushrooms are robustly edible and they eat them around the world, but some people do experience GI upset because they can be kind of slimy, and anything that's kind of slimy, I find that somebody somewhere is going to have some kind of reaction to it. So certainly, we were heartened by knowing that they were indeed armillaria honey fungi. But then we came home and cooked up a few and with trepidation tried them. And much to my surprise and delight, they were delicious and I didn't get sick from eating them. So one thing I can say now is when I do eat honey mushrooms, they're not a super top tier mushroom unless they're very young, and then they can be pretty good. As soon as they kind of open up, they can get a little tough. So usually with honey mushrooms, I don't eat the stem or the stipe. I'll just eat the cap. And I actually like to boil them often because it helps to get off some of the sliminess. And then you can do sort of a slow saute in a pan to get them nice and brown, and they get really tasty. So again, that was kind of the last experience I had as a kid, was my parents being like, hey, you should join this mycological society. And then I became a preteen, and suddenly everything that I thought was cool about mushrooms for a long time was not cool. And I kind of didn't care about it. And maybe even somewhere there as a teenager and in my early college years, I might have been classified as being a little mycophobic. And that's just the idea that with mushrooms and fungi in general, they're sort of cryptic. They're kind of hidden. We don't see them in our environment generally unless they pop up as a mushroom. And it's kind of scary to think about the fact that they're everywhere. They're in soil, they're in wood, they're hiding. And I think a little bit as a young person, I kind of feared what fungi represented. And I think a lot of people have that in common, that you end up fearing what you don't know, what you don't understand. And certainly in society, people will tell you, oh, mushrooms are toxic, they can kill you. Oh, mushrooms are drugs, you should stay away from them. And so there's not a lot of positive feedback or media about how mushrooms are cool and they can be your friend and they can be vastly interesting and tasty and all this kind of thing. At least when I was growing up, that kind of media didn't exist. We've always had Paul Stamets, and he's been a huge inspiration to a lot of people, but he tends to focus very much on the kind of areas of psychedelics and let's just call them more esoteric pursuits. And so I don't think he does a lot to change people's perceptions on mushrooms in terms of not being afraid of them, because I think in some ways he sort of stokes those fears that people have about them. And so I think for a long time, I just kind of forgot about mushrooms and kind of ignored them. But I did come back to fungi, and that was very much through being a college student, because I went to UC Santa Cruz and I was on the sailing team. And on the sailing team, we had some phenomenal brewers who were on the team with me. And so one year, our team captain, this guy Reed, who later went on to work at several very high-profile breweries, was brewing a lot of really, really good beer for our parties. And I was like, wow, our sailing team parties are so much more fun and so much better than the rest of these crappy college parties that have like, natty ice in a keg kind of thing. It's like, we have like really good beer. We have it on tap. We're drinking brown ales and IPAs and all sorts of like really good stuff that Reed is brewing. He also worked at a homebrew store. And so after seeing what Reed had done and kind of being inspired myself, I went out and bought a burner and a kettle and some of the basic equipment, sterilization stuff for brewing my own beer. And I got really interested in how different yeast could influence the beer style. Because with beer, you have a couple different things to kind of influence what your beer turns out as. And it's, the kinds of malts that you use and then the kind of hops that you use. But very much so, the style of the beer is driven and determined by the kind of yeast you use. So whether you are making like an ale yeast that ferments fairly warm, or you're making a lager that ferments fairly cold, you have some distinct yeast strains and even potentially species that are helping to determine the flavor and character of your beer. And I just thought that was so cool, especially reading about it and understanding like the influence of temperature, of nutrients, of like strain history and how old the yeast was. There was all these things that I sort of just like, wow, this is fascinating. And this sort of transformation alchemy that the yeast are doing by creating these flavors is something that really interested me and actually drove me to pursue graduate work. That was a big part of why I went to graduate school, because I wanted to take the interest I had in fermentation and yeast and kind of expand my knowledge base. So when I got to UC Davis, I went and talked to Charlie Bamforth, who was sort of the beer professor at the time. And Charlie is a phenomenal educator, really interesting guy. But he told me to piss off. He's like, I don't take PhD students. There's no jobs for them in beer. And, I think ultimately, I don't know if I agree with him. There's no jobs for, PhDs in beer, but I was glad that Charlie didn't take me as a student, because it allowed me to go find Linda Bassan, who was a really famous yeast geneticist working in wine. And that was exciting because I didn't know that much about wine, certainly not wine production, and not compared to what I knew about beer, at least. And it was nice too, because like I was very passionate about beer, but if you work on the thing you're passionate about, sometimes it kind of ruins the passion a little bit. So instead I got to work on wine, which I liked and was interested in, but wasn't quite as passionate as I was about beer. So I didn't have to overthink my beer. And instead I got overly analytical on all things wine, which was fun, because wine is maybe a little bit more nuanced, and it's a little more depth. And there's certainly a very wide world of wine to explore that is somewhat different from beer. And so I learned a lot about both those worlds concurrently. And throughout my grad career, I was very lucky to be part of tasting groups where pretty much every single week I would taste through like 10 to 12 wines with students, and another like 5 or 6 beers with another group of students. And then frequently I'd also just go do my own quote unquote beer tasting at some of the local breweries. And had a chance too to talk to people who are in production, people who are managing yeast, people who are doing wild sour fermentation. So I got a lot of exposure to the different kinds of microbiology, and particularly different kinds of fungi, not just Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the yeast that does fermentation, but also stuff like Brettanomyces bruxellensis, which is another type of yeast that in wine is a spoilage yeast, and then in beer is an accepted part of how they make the sour beers and those kind of lambics I was talking about. So it was really cool to see all those different aspects of microbiology and understand too. What I got in grad school was the ability to learn, to teach myself, and a really good background in some sort of basics of fungal physiology, metabolism, and ecology. And so that set me up really nicely because after I graduated, I had a chance to learn a whole lot more. But there was a few things that kind of happened too while I was in grad school. I dated a girl who was very outdoorsy. And it's funny because at the time I wasn't particularly outdoorsy. And so I think I felt a little bit threatened by how comfortable she was outside. But she dragged me along a few times to hikes, and I enjoyed them, but at the time I didn't realize that I had plantar fasciitis too, so I was sort of being a real wuss about like getting to hike around. But I got a few exposures in going out with her that made me, kind of reignited a little bit of my fungal fascination, my passion there. Because one time we saw a porcini, turned out to be completely rotted out by bugs, but I was like, oh my God, what is that thing? And this is a, porcini. This is a big Boletus edulis. She'd taken a mushroom class, so she was sort of familiar with some of the stuff. But I was, just really excited about it, but also had absolutely no idea what I was doing and really didn't understand kind of the broader context of how this mushroom fit into other things. But I went out with her a few times and I saw some jelly fungi and some hedgehogs. And so I got a little bit of exposure. But again, when we broke up, I kind of stopped thinking about it and sort of ignored it. And it wasn't until a couple years later, when I was with a different partner and we were actually snowed in Mendocino, and I went completely stir crazy because we couldn't drive anywhere. So we ended up just kind of walking around on the property of her parents own. And the only thing that was alive, because the middle of winter, were mushrooms. So there was some really bright red mushrooms. There were some pink ones. There's a few things that I was just kind of like, what is this? And I started trying to do research and trying to figure it out. And it's really difficult to find mushrooms on the internet by just describing them. It's a lot easier if you have photos. And I did have photos, but at the time I didn't know how I could upload those photos and actually get feedback from anyone. So I was sort of just like trying to blast, like, what is this mushroom that looks like this thing? And I had some limited success and got some early sort of practice at cutting my teeth on how to figure out things were. But I really didn't, learn much. I tried eating one or two things and was like, okay, this is like kind of scary because I could potentially eat something bad. And, I was a little worried about it. And frankly, like hunting for mushrooms in North America can be really confusing because there's all these, like, there's East Coast varieties and West Coast varieties and like North and South. And there's a lot of ambiguity there, and it's really difficult to kind of figure out what's what. But I continued to kind of push myself a little bit and try to learn more. And it was living in New Zealand back in 2017. I lived there from about February through June. And they have the opposite seasons than we do because it's Southern Hemisphere. So we were there for a wine harvest, and my ex was working like 12 hours a day. I was supposed to be writing papers on yeast for the end of my grad work. But I got really bored and I started just going for hikes. And it was a really severe like rain year. So there was all these kind of like hurricane, like typhoon things coming in and just dumping water. So the days that it was dumping water, I wasn't out in the woods, but like the day after I'd go out and see what had come up. And I started finding boletes and shaggy ink caps. And there's this one mushroom in New Zealand that kind of sparked my whole interest. And it was this thing called Agroscope parasitica. There's this beautiful velvety brown mushroom that looks a lot like a piapini. If you guys have seen those, this is basically a New Zealand version of a piapini. But they were pretty big. And they'd grow out of trees and they were brown and velvety. And I eventually figured out what they were. I found out there was no toxic lookalikes. There was really no way I could confuse what this mushroom was. It was exactly, what it was and what I saw. So I picked it and I cooked it and I ate it. And the way that I did this is, again, how I try every new mushroom, same sort of protocol, is to be really sure of what you've got, find it a couple times before you consider eating it. When you do take it home, make sure you take like a nice prime young specimen, clean it, cook it well, and then try a very small piece and see how you feel. And, after an hour or two, if you don't feel anything, no bubbly, no weird feelings, you can eat a little bit more. And that's a good thing. But, don't eat too much. Try a little bit and then wait 24 hours. See if you have any sort of, other complications or feelings that arise. If you've done all of that, you can say, okay, maybe now I can put these mushrooms in with some food, try eating them as part of a dish. And I think ultimately I ended up making some fish and mushroom tacos with those Agroscope parasitica, and then started kind of regularly going back to some of the same spots and harvesting it. And it began to feel a little bit more like foraging, like grocery shopping, and got a little bit more adventurous with some of the different things I was trying. Because there really are quite a few mushrooms you can eat really with no concern of having anything toxic. But you do want to follow sort of the basic identification steps. You do want to get feedback from people online. And you do always want to be very careful about the first time you try something, because there's plenty of edible mushrooms that do cause issues for people. Shiitakes are one that, like, a lot of people can get sick from an undercooked shiitake. So you really want to cook your shiitakes well. Morels are another one that's a very popular edible mushroom, but can make you quite sick if you don't cook it enough. So there's good reasons to not eat mushrooms raw, to always understand what you're eating and to, cook things and try small bits before you kind of go all in on something. So those were all kind of the origins of my fascination with fungi. And what happened is while I was in New Zealand and I was taking hundreds of photos of mushrooms on my phone, I was still trying to kind of like figure out what things were online. And then I discovered that there was a community of people on Instagram posting really cool mushroom shots. And so I made a separate account and started following a bunch of mushroom accounts and started just posting the photos of mushrooms that I've been taking because I wanted to stop spamming my normal friends with all these mushroom photos. And I found really incredible feedback from people that were helping me to identify stuff, helping me to learn photography, helping me to like recognize mushrooms in a more general way. And really just the exposure of seeing all these different kinds of mushrooms in such an incredible mixture of colors and shapes and textures and all these things on social media vastly changed the way that I view the world. And it really gave me something to kind of sink my teeth into, because certainly after graduate school, I was looking for something. I wanted to learn something because I had certainly gained this incredible ability to teach myself and wasn't really sure what I was going to do with it. And, I'm still passionate about yeast and fermentation, but I needed something new. And I found great solace in going to the woods, taking photos, and really looking at all of these incredible mushrooms that were out there. So that is a big part of the tapestry that weave my fascination with fungi and certainly kind of helped me become who I am today. So, the hiking, the food, social media, community, and finding that catharsis in nature is a big part of why I love mushrooms so much and how they've really helped me grow. And I hope to continue sharing that passion with you guys. So in the future, going to be coming up with more cool topics to talk about. I'm going to be diving into particular kinds of mushrooms, certainly ways that we eat and prepare mushrooms. I'll be talking about ethics. I'll be talking about, social media and the intersection of education, entertainment, some of all these things. So I hope that you guys come on back for more episodes of the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. So be well, guys. Bye-bye. I'm